Can you see Juhani Pallasmaa?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, so I'm starting now. There are still people waiting to be admitted, so maybe you can try to admit people waiting in the lobby while I start reading the CV of Juhani Pallasmaa. Okay, so welcome everybody. Tonight we have a very important guest. He's a very well-known architect and writer, and I really thank him heartily for accepting our offer or our invitation to be with our students and colleagues tonight. I would like to read his short CV, and then in English first, and then in Turkish, and then I will leave the floor to Juhani Pallasmaa. Juhani Pallasmaa is an architect, designer, writer, and professor emeritus. He practiced design in collaboration with other architects since 1962, and in 1983 to 2012 through his office in Helsinki. He has held positions as rector of the Institute of Industrial Design, director of the Museum of Finnish Architecture, professor and dean of the School of Architecture, Helsinki University of Technology, and several visiting professorships in the United States. He has taught and lectured in numerous universities in Europe, North and South America, Africa, Asia, and Australia. He is a member of the Pritzker Award Prize jury 2008 to 2014. He has published 60 books and over 400 essays, articles, and prefaces, and his writings have been translated into 35 languages. His widely known books include The Embodied Image, The Eyes of the Skin. He is honorary member of SAPA, AIA, RIBA, and the International Academician of the International Academy of Architecture, and he has received numerous Finnish and international awards and 5 honorary doctorates. Now, shortly in Turkish. Juhani Pallasmaa, Finlandiyalı mimar, tasarımcı, yazar, emekli profesör. 1962'den beri çeşitli mimarlarla işbirliği içinde ve 1983-2012'de Helsinki'deki ofisi aracılığıyla mimari tasarım uygulamaları gerçekleştirmiştir. Endüstri Ürünleri Tasarımı Enstitüsü Rektörlüğü, Finlandiya Mimarlık Müzesi Müdürlüğü, Helsinki Teknoloji Üniversitesi Mimarlık Fakültesi Dekanlığı ve Profesörlük ile Amerika Birleşik Devletleri'nde pek çok üniversitede misafir profesörlük görevlerinde bulunmuştur. Avrupa, Kuzey ve Güney Amerika, Afrika, Asya ve Avustralya'da çok sayıda üniversitede dersler vermiştir. 2008-2014 tarihlerinde Pritzker Mimarlık Ödülü jüri üyeliği görevini icra etmiştir. 60 kitap ve 400'den fazla deneme, makale ve ön söz yayınlamış ve yazıları 35 dile çevrilmiştir. Yaygın olarak bilinen kitapları The Embodied Image, The Eyes of the Skin, Ten'in Gözleri olarak çevrildi Türkçe'ye. Bu kitaplar, tabii 60 tane kitap var, hepsini sayamıyorum. Pallasmaa, AIA ve RIBA'nin onursal üyesi ve Uluslararası Mimarlık Akademisi üyesidir. Çok sayıda ulusal ve uluslararası ödülü ve 5 adet onursal doktorası bulunmaktadır. Bugün birlikte olduğumuz için gerçekten onur duyuyoruz. We are really honored to be with you, Mr. Pallasmaa. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. Let me explain first what I plan to do. I am going to have a 1-hour lecture for which I first gave a title, Thought, Form and Meaning, and subtitle, Drawing and Writing Architecture. But I realize now that for the images, I changed the subtitle to My Design Work and Phenomenology. At any rate, because for me it makes a difference whether someone speaking about architecture is an architect or a scholar. I'm an architect, and that is why I'm running a sequence of images of my work while I speak. But what I say is not at all connected with the images. The images just show the second half of my character, the drawing part. I'll begin with a preamble. I want to begin my talk quoting one of my favorite writers, Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian poet. This is what he writes in his book entitled The Maker. Quote, "A man sets himself the task of portraying the world. Over the years, he fills a given surface with images of provinces and kingdoms, mountains, bays, ships, islands, fish, rooms, instruments, heavenly bodies, horses, and people. Shortly before he dies, he discovers that this patient labyrinth of lines is a drawing of his own face." End of Borges' quote. This literary description points out how the world and the self are fused in creative work. Working on an artistic project is also bound to be working on oneself. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, points out this dual perspective as he writes, quote, "Philosophy and architecture are similar. They are both ways of working on oneself." End of quote. My lecture will be about how my view of the world, my work, and sense of self have gradually mingled in my work, experience, and sense of life. In my case, also design work and writing about it have eventually fused, and nowadays I do not separate the two. I closed the design activities of my office in 2011 at the age of 75. Since I stopped design work, I have been working on books, essays, and introductions, as well as lecturing and teaching around the world. I will show images of my work in architecture and product, exhibition and graphic design, as well as my artistic experiments without commenting them. As the example of designing a fragrance might suggest, I have designed almost everything that a designer can design, from urban and architectural designs to furniture, objects, graphic design, sculpture, and collages to a gold coin for the Bank of Finland. My last architectural design commission was a concert hall in northern Finland, entitled the Korundi Art Center and Concert Hall, inaugurated in 2011. When the first musical note hit my ear in the opening concert, I felt very happy and understood that my profession as an architect would not give me a better moment, and I decided to stop my design work right there. Sorry, aren't we moving with the images? at least my screen still shows the first image. We should now be further in number 3. Yes. Next morning, I flew back to Helsinki and told my assistants in the office, "This is it, folks." After the concert hall, I have only designed a perfume for the International Fragrance and Flavor Company in New York. The perfume was exhibited in an exhibition of new scents during the summer of 2012 in New York. When I was contacted by phone and invited to collaborate with a team of perfume chemists, I answered that I will be 80.
Juhani, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt, but your microphone is turned off. Could you please turn it on? Sorry, my interruption. Your mic is turned off.
It should be on now.
Yes. Thank you. I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's much better. But can you talk a little bit louder, Juhani?
Well, I will try.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know what turned it on off because I didn't touch it.
Okay, no problem. We're listening with interest.
Yes, the lady who called me from New York answered that they do not know that they do know this biological fact, but they also know that memories of odors, smells, stay longest in human memory. They expected me to design a fragrance based on my memory of odors, rather than my current sense of smell. I agreed to participate, but I felt that there is too much of everything in the contemporary consumerist world. Too many images, sounds, objects, publications, fashions and smells. I did not like to add another fragrance in this already overcrowded world. I suggested the idea of creating an absent scent, a silence of smell, as it were, a desire for an olfactory experience, rather than an active odor. In deep silence, your sense of hearing is not dead either. It is alert in an active state of waiting. I gave the sensation of standing in the middle of a snowfield in a 30 below 0 centigrade weather as an example. There is no odor, but the nostrils are highly activated by the purity of the cold air. I am from Canada and I know what you mean, the lady said. The team of 6 perfume chemists and I, in collaboration, began to design an absent odor familiar to me since my early childhood. The fragrance was later entitled Twilight, to stress the biological fact that we are twilight animals. as our eyes have not evolved for bright daylight, and also in recognition of the denial of an active order. I have given my lecture a subtitle, My Phenomenology, a Confession. As most architects seem to experience phenomenology as a difficult and vague philosophical approach, I decided to focus on the philosophical frame of my writings in the form of an intimate personal confession. I never intended or deliberately decided to become an architectural writer, critic, theorist, or philosopher. In the book of the Disquiet, the great Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, who wrote in 52 pseudonyms, confesses, quote, "I was a poet animated by philosophy, not a philosopher with poetic faculties," end of quote. As I have no formal philosophical training, I wish to paraphrase the poet's confession and say, I am an architect animated by philosophy, not a philosopher with architectural interests. I have slowly drifted into thinking and writing about architecture, and nowadays I find myself doing that practically full time. I wrote my first article in 1966, and this year I have written an essay, lecture, or introduction to a book roughly every 10th day. By now, I have published over 60 books and some 900 essays and other writings. I wish to say already at this point that I have developed a way of writing that is similar to my way of designing and sketching. I proceed without a clear idea by touching and feeling. My way, both in design and writing. The ideas are always results of the process, never preconceptions. That is why I feel that I have not changed my craft, as I continue doing the same thing, imagining architectural situations and encounters, now in words instead of spaces and materials. I was educated as an architect in the modernist and rationalist manner of the 1950s and 60s, and sought a rational and scientific ground for my design work and thinking. My professor was the legendary Aulus Blomstedt, a refined architect who was the rationalist and theory-oriented counterpoint of Alvar Aalto in Finland during the 50s and 60s, and an authoritative teacher. He made significant studies in proportional harmony, aspiring to unite the harmonic principles of visual phenomena and music following the Pythagorean traditions. He was married to the youngest daughter of Jean Sibelius, the great Finnish composer, and his younger brother was an acknowledged orchestra conductor. I had the good luck of becoming his assistant and eventually close friend. I made 2 exhibitions on his studies in harmony, which were shown in several countries, and also collaborated in making a film on his work in proportional and modular harmony. Architecture, along with my neo-Bauhaus education. After my 2 years as rector of the Institute of Industrial Arts in Helsinki, I suddenly decided to take a teaching position in 1972 in Ethiopia for the Finnish Development Aid Program. During my 2 years of teaching architecture at the Haile Selassie First University in Addis Ababa, I lost my former confidence in Western rationality and the unquestioned benevolence of technology, as well as in the universality of culture, values, and thought. I learned that even our senses are culturally tuned. In Africa, I began to read anthropological and psychoanalytic literature. The studies of Edward T. Hall on the unconscious mechanisms of spatial behavior, the research of Melville Herskovich and his team on cultural differences in perception of visual illusions, and the writings of Carl Jung, Erich Neumann, and Edward Edinger on archetypes turned my thinking away from narrow and obsessive rationality. I became interested in the inner mental worlds and the essential interplay of these multiple worlds. My desire for certainty was replaced by a fascination with the meanings and values of doubt and uncertainty, and I became aware of the immense realm of the human unconsciousness. After returning back to Finland in the summer of 1974, I was introduced to a group of progressive thinkers in various fields, all older than myself, in a series of bi-monthly conversations on life, environment, mental world, healing, and the arts. In addition to 3 progressive Jungian therapists, the group consisted of 2 philosophers, a poet, a theologian, a pianist, 3 architects, and occasionally an invited visitor. The conversations lasted for 15 years, and I began to read such books as Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom, Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, and Alexander Lowen's books on therapy and the human body. The mental diagnosis of the Western industrial societies of these 2 social psychiatrists, as well as the therapists' ideas on the hopeless narrowness of the linguistic communication channel in relation to potential problems of the body, in the way we exist in the, as well as the vast embodied wisdom, began to guide my thinking in architecture. I realized the significance of the human body in the way we exist in the world, sense it, and express it in the arts. I began to realize the central role of our bodily and existential experiences in architecture. And I am still on this path, same path, 45 years later. I also began to realize the possibilities of empathic thought and the verbalized approach in the worlds of experience and design. Regardless of Dr. Lowen's engagement of the body in therapy, our normal communication is dominated by language. In the late 1970s, it seems that the images are now stuck. Can you move them on? In the late 1970s, I encountered Gaston Bachelard's Poetics of Space. By the way, the book was pointed out to me by Daniel Liebeskind in the bookshop of the Cranbrook Academy. And it opened up a new world, the realm of poetic imagination and dreams, poetic imagination and material imagery. So a world where perception, thought, imagination, and dreams were united. I became aware of the poetic and existential ground of architecture, as opposed to mere visual aesthetics and compositions. I began to read philosophers, psychologists of creativity, scientists, mainly physicists and natural scientists, and later also neuroscientists. Along with scientific literature, can you move the images onwards?
Yes, we'll move them on. Just 1 second, please.
Okay. Along with scientific literature, I have always eagerly read novels and poetry. Books consist of and open up marvelous worlds, the most significant world for me. All artworks are worlds. Quote, an artistic image is not a specific meaning by the artist. They are entire worlds as reflected from a drop of water. End of quote. Andrei Tarkovsky, one of my favorite film directors, suggests. My personal library consists of 10,000 books, and it constitutes the geography of the sources of my thinking. I have donated my books to the Museum of Finnish Architecture, but with an agreement that as long as I actively write, I keep them in my former office. My library is a kind of a mental forest in which I walk. In 1985, I wrote an essay entitled The Geometry of Feeling, which has later been republished in international anthologies on architectural theory as an example of architectural phenomenology. I must say honestly that only while working on that very essay, I became aware of phenomenology as a line of philosophical inquiry. And I added a short chapter on this philosophical approach in my essay, mainly for the purposes of clarifying my own view. Yet, even today, I do not claim to be a phenomenologist due to my lack of formal philosophical education. I would rather say that my current view of architecture and art is parallel to what I understand the phenomenological stance to be. My phenomenology arises from my experiences as an architect, teacher, writer, and collaborator with numerous artists, as well as excessive travels around the world and my experiences of life in general. In recent years, I have had the opportunity of lecturing with some of the leading phenomenological writers in the fields of philosophy, art, and architecture. The Dutch phenomenologist Van den Berg argues somewhat surprisingly, quote, painters and poets are born phenomenologists, end of quote. And I believe that I am similarly a born phenomenologist for my formative childhood observations and experiences at my former grandfather's humble farmhouse in central Finland during the war years of 1939 to 45, and my later engagement in the artistic world. In farm life during the war years, everything in daily life was grounded on personal observations and embodied skills and knowledge. One learned through watching and doing. My grandfather gave me a sharp adult's knife at the age of 5. I still have numerous scars in my fingers, but I learned how to use my hands and the knife. The neurobiologist Zemir Tseki makes a parallel argument to the effect that, quote, most painters are also neurologists, unquote, in the sense of intuitively understanding the neurological principles of brain activity. Nearly 15 years ago, a Swedish scholar, architectural scholar, Dr. Åsa Dahlin, actually studied in her doctoral dissertation the parallels in my writings and not those of the neurologist Antonio Damasio. But these affinities are totally coincidental, as I have read Damasio's important books only after having written my essays referred to by the Swedish scholar. I must sincerely say that I'm an amateur in philosophy, although I have read countless books by philosophers due to my personal interest in the enigma of human existence and consciousness and the essence of life. I consider myself an amateur in every sense, and I have even developed a suspicion for expertise. Quote, the craftsman does not collect expertise, he collects uncertainties, unquote, as Joseph Brodsky, the poet, wisely remarked. I have been particularly impressed by the writings of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, whose thinking I have found inspiringly open-ended and optimistic. He is a truly poetic philosopher whose expressions often possess the magic of poetry and art. His philosophy has made me understand the chiasmatic way in which the mental and the material worlds intertwine, and that view has also opened up new ways of understanding artistic and architectural phenomena. I understand phenomenology in accordance with the notion of the founder of the movement, Edmund Husserl, as, quote, pure looking, unquote, an innocent and unbiased encounter with phenomena, in the same manner that a painter looks at a landscape, a poet seeks a poetic expression for a particular human experience, and an architect imagines an existentially meaningful space. I have also realized that the original meaning of the Greek word theorein was to observe, not to speculate. My theorizing is a curious and intense looking at things in order to reveal their essences, connections, interactions, and meanings. I also feel sympathy for Goethe's view of science, which he called zarte Empirie, delicate empiricism, the thinking that aspires to observe without changing and violating the phenomenon in question. I do not aim at orthodox philosophizing as I write in the associative manner of literary essays, and I have no hesitation to combine scientific findings with my experiential and sensory observations and phenomenological formulations. Nowadays, I also try to achieve literary qualities in my writings because I have learned that aesthetic qualities of language make the reader more open-minded and receptive, as she receives simultaneously the intellectual meaning and an aesthetic and emotional impact. My phenomenological thinking began with an interest in the senses, and this led me soon to critique the hegemony of vision in Western culture, which emerged already in Greek philosophy. This emphasis has been dramatically accelerated by technology, especially writing and mechanical printing, as Walter J. Ong has suggested in his fine book entitled Orality and Literacy. As a consequence of the dominance of vision, architecture has been usually presented as a visual art form. I realized early on the significance of touch, particularly the conscious hapticity concealed in vision, and the general hatred of the body in Western thinking, to quote Friedrich Nietzsche. We acknowledge the 5 Aristotelian senses, but Steinerian philosophy categorizes 12 senses, including the senses of self and being. After several decades of thinking, writing, and design work, I am convinced that the most important sense in architecture is not vision, but our existential sense, our sense of self. We exist in the flesh of the world, to use the significant notion of Merleau-Ponty, and architecture gives us our foothold in this very flesh. Architecture carves our niche in the flesh of the world. Thinking itself is understood as a cerebral, conceptual, and linguistic activity, but the areas of embodied, sensory, material, and emotive thinking are equally important in the arts, if not more important. I have also become convinced that peripheral and unfocused perceptions are more important in architecture than focused percepts. Unfocused peripheral perceptions give rise to boundless existential fields, atmospheres, and emotions, while focused perception primarily serves conceptual knowledge. Simply, focused vision makes us outsiders, whereas embracing peripheral and diffuse perceptions turn us insiders and participants. This view makes the formal and geometric dominance in architectural theory and education questionable in comparison with a more comprehensive existential, experiential, and atmospheric understanding of the phenomenon. Now the images seem to be stuck again. We experience the world and ourselves in it, in a simultaneous, synthetic, and multisensory manner. Merleau-Ponty expresses this simultaneity succinctly. Quote, "My perception is not a sum of visual, tactile, and audible givens. I perceive in a total way with my whole being. I grasp a unique structure of the thing and a unique way of being, which speaks to all my senses at once." End of Merleau-Ponty quote. Art and architecture are constituted in experience, which implies that ultimately the poetic dimension only exists in the lived and unique individual experience. This was the crucial message of John Dewey, the American philosopher, in his seminal book, Art as Experience, which was published already in 1934. I do not aim at or even believe in a prescriptive verbalized architectural theory. It is in its very essence, architecture is fundamentally an existential and embodied encounter, and it arises from existential experiences and embodied wisdom rather than intellectualized and formalized theories. We can only prepare ourselves for our work in architecture by developing a distinct sensitivity and awareness for situations of life and an architecture and architectural phenomena. Simply, we need to identify ourselves with architecture and its experiences and meanings. The act of looking at architecture implies, in fact, encountering and living architecture, and a visual observation has to be accompanied by an imaginative and fully embodied experience. And even multisensory experiencing is not sufficient. The projection of one's self on the architectural setting has to take place, and the spaces need to be internalized to become part of the viewer's sense of self. As I enter a space, the space enters me. An experience of art and architecture is always an exchange. All profound artistic experiences are thus essentially exchanges. As I enter a space, the space enters me, and as I read a poem, the poem reads me. For me, phenomenology is the subtle art of intuiting how we encounter the world. Quote, "How could a painter or poet express anything other than his encounter with the world?" End of quote. Merleau-Ponty asks, and an architect is bound to explore and express this very same encounter. For me, working as an architect has been more a privileged opportunity to learn about my own relationship with the world than a distinct profession or a means of making my living. Besides, the philosopher argues that the essence of art is always beyond it. Quote, "We come to see not the work of art, but the world according to the work." This sentence by Merleau-Ponty is a fundamental deep thought. This is a truly deep wisdom. Architecture is an art of mediation. It mediates between the world and the individual self. I believe that I am an architect primarily for the reason that this craft offers particularly essential and meaningful possibilities of touching the boundaries of one's self and the world, and of experiencing how they mingle and fuse into each other. Architecture is a logistically complex and philosophically controversial subject. The phenomenon of architecture contains several fundamental contradictions. It is utility and expression, technique and poetry, materiality and spirituality, durability and sensuality, aesthetics and metaphysics, ethics and compassion, all at the same time. Alvarado understood the internally conflicting nature of architecture as he said, quote, "Whatever our task, whether large or small, in every case, opposites must be reconciled. Almost every formal assignment involves dozens, often hundreds, sometimes thousands of conflicting elements that can be forced into functional harmony only by an act of will. This harmony cannot be achieved by any other means than art." End of Alvarado quote. As architecture is simultaneously an end and a means, it cannot be prescribed, and it is bound to emerge through a creative process of mediation, compromise, and synthesis. The most poetic and enigmatic entity of Louis Kahn is the empty outdoor space of the Salk Institute facing the Pacific Ocean. This metaphysical space could not have been programmed or specified in advance. It is the result of the arduous process of design itself. It was found rather than designed. All true qualities in art are found and encountered, not invented. In my life, all the really important things have been accidentally found or encountered. You can genuinely find only something that you did not even know you were missing. Due to its growing conceptual complexity in the technological age, architecture is increasingly approached rationally as a task of preconceived and standardized knowledge, expertise, and problem solving. And as a consequence, the metaphysical, mental, and emotive realities of building are increasingly suppressed. Besides, architecture is losing its artistic autonomy and existential sincerity, and the architect's work is turning into a service profession, providing services for cultural, political, and corporate visibility, investment, and speculation. The task of architectural philosophy is to reveal these biases and distortions in the prevailing view and practice of the craft. The phenomenological approach, which encounters architecture in its lived and real material and mental dimensions, is an important counterforce to today's formalistic, intellectualized, and logocentric views, which prevail in both theory and practice. Even architectural phenomenology is bound to communicate ideas through words, but it acknowledges and identifies the lived imageries hidden in architectural encounters, and it illuminates their experiential and mental essences. The phenomenologist encounters and senses architecture instead of analyzing it, and reinforces and reveals the lived mental reality of this art form. No approach or method in itself can be a guarantee for a meaningful result. Phenomenology can degenerate into empty verbalism or groundless intellectual fabrication. As David Seaman, a phenomenological geographer who has written some of the most clear-minded descriptions on the use of the phenomenological method, wisely observes, quote, "The phenomenological enterprise is a highly personal, interpretive venture. In trying to see the phenomenon, it is very easy to see too much or too little." End of quote. I was initially attracted to Gaston Bachelard's poetic writings because of their combined precision, poetic radiance, and sense of authority. The writer's long background as philosopher of science gives a special credibility to his poetic observations, and sometimes seem to approach absurdity and paradox. In my view, paradox and absurdity are essential dimensions of human existence. Yet sincerity and precision are irreplaceable criteria and virtues in phenomenological thought. Quote, "Is there anything more mysterious than clarity?" Unquote. Paul Valéry, the poet, asks appropriately. Yet the poet is not speaking about intellectual clarity, but poetic clarity. I want to re-emphasize that I write about architecture and life world as a practicing architect and designer who is also engaged in the realm of the arts. I write in the same manner and with the same intentions that I sketch and draw, open-mindedly and without preconceptions or preconceived ideas. The words arise in the same manner as the lines of a drawing unfold, semi-automatically, as a result of the collaboration of the hand, the eye, and the mind, revealing an image that has been hiding somewhere in the folds of thoughts, associations, and embodied memories. Both the drawing and the sentence aspire to give a shape to an emergent feeling, a shapeless complex of uncertainty and intuitive assurance that acquire intentionality and meaning at the moment of their very emergence. As a consequence of my way of working, a design task and an essay are very similar, yet they seem to be causally unrelated and exist in different realities as two parallel but independent products of observation. Yet they are unified in the existential experience. Rainer Maria Rilke points out that poetic images arise from experiences. Quote, "For verses are not, as people imagine, simply feelings. They are experiences. For the sake of a single verse, one must see many cities, men and things. One must know the animals. One must feel how the birds fly and know the gesture with which the little flowers open in the morning." End of Rilke quote. Until the age of 40, I used to classify my books in two categories: architecture books and other books. Then I realized that my first category mostly dealt with architecture as an aestheticized formalism, whereas the second category posed cities, buildings, and settings in integration with life situations and human characters. During the past 40 years, I have regarded all books as architecture books, because all human situations, histories, fictions, actions, and thoughts are facilitated and framed by human constructions, spaces, and artifacts. Our spatial, material, and mental constructions provide essential horizons for understanding, and they expand our mental worlds out to the physical world. In human consciousness, everything merges into other things in a dreamlike manner. I read poems, listen to music, look at paintings, and watch films as potential architectural propositions. They are all exercises in and inspirations for architectural ideas. When I have begun a new project, I have not looked at architectural precedents. I have looked at the early Renaissance paintings of Fra Angelico and Duccio and other Siena school painters. I do not hesitate to suggest that the next phase in responsible Western thinking will question today's quasi-rationality, surreal materialism, and violent instrumentalization and focusing of knowledge. I believe that we are approaching an era of biological knowledge, metaphors and ecologically contextual thinking. This new awareness will underscore the biohistorical and mental realities of human life, culture, and arts. It seems evident to me that our perceptual, embodied, and neural systems have developed the way they are in order to make us capable of processing existentially crucial reactions and knowledge. As a consequence, even aesthetics and ethics must thus be grounded in our biological historicity. Quote, "Believe it or not, the purpose of evolution is beauty," unquote. Joseph Brodsky argues with the assurance of a master poet. This biohistorical cultural perspective can also give a new significance to the phenomenological position, which seeks a mental interiority in our experience of the world, the Weltinnenraum, the inner space of the world, to use a beautiful notion of Rainer Maria Rilke, one of the greatest poetic thinkers of all time. Thank you. I came to the end of my talk, and I'm ready to answer your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Juhani Pallasmaa, for this wonderful lecture. I think maybe the audience, our students and colleagues, would like to ask a few questions to you. So maybe 15 to 20 minutes, we will ask them if they have any questions. Actually, it's always difficult to ask the first question. Maybe I will start with a simple question. I have noticed that you have criticized the project, the Guggenheim project that was going to be built in Helsinki. And because you said it's a consumerist and touristic approach rather than talking about the cultural and humane task of art. Could you elaborate more on that?
Well, in the case of the Guggenheim Museum, it was really an American business enterprise where the artistic dimension was a bit secondary. I was also disappointed with the result of the competition, where there were more than 1,500 entries, and at least the ones that were priced in the exhibition did not pay attention sufficiently to the fact that the site is next to one of the finest neoclassical areas of architecture, which I think simply reveals the fact that architecture has become too autistic in today's world. In my view, architecture is always about something else. It is exactly about the landscape, about the setting, about history, etc., about human life. I'm critical of today's architecture altogether, which sees architecture as an invitation or possibility for inventing something visually eye-catching. That's not architecture. Architecture says something about the world. That is architecture's task, is to give us our foothold in the world.
Okay, thank you very much. There is a question about your books. İdil İnan asks, I wonder which book changed Pallasmaa's vision about design and writing.
I cannot focus on a single book. I mentioned quite a number here, just as an example for the students to start reading and read something else than architecture books. Any book, sciences, poetry, natural sciences, they are very inspiring books for architects, or anyone in the creative field.
Okay, and so are there any other questions? We're expecting you to write. Maybe
May I ask,
maybe
Neslihan,
would like to ask something.
may I ask
The audience?
May I ask a question, please?
Yes.
This is Aysu from Ankara. Luckily, coincidentally, in my lecture, I talk about you with my students. And among the, you perfectly describe in your language, poetic, the essence, the spirit of place. I almost read all your books and your videos in the YouTube. I'm impressed the way you describe the space. Even if I visited the place, I feel like I'm being there. What I talk about today, not only you, yes, I have shown my students only almost 10 slides of your work and your descriptions. And Nobel Schulz was one of them, and then you and Peter Zumthor and so on. But you know what is interesting, what is missing probably compared to Nobel Schulz, experience is the keyword. You have to experience to have a certain knowledge, to feel, to sense, and it relates with meaning. When you keep on experiencing space, you might have different impression, different sensation, and the essence. And
I saw
why I am coming to my question. I'm coming to my question. I'm coming to my question. You know, you are impressed. I know Louis Kahn's work, Salt Institute, and also watch the video. You know, the concrete, today's material is concrete, and you believe that you evoke the feelings. And have you ever asked or look what people living inside think about the building, living inside, experiencing once? You never mention. I haven't seen any of your words. Thank you. This is my question.
I have visited the Salk Institute several times, but one is not permitted inside into the laboratories. So I have only experienced it from outside and the corridors. But I know that the people who work there have a high respect for its architecture and the way it presents the landscape and the distant Pacific Ocean to them. By the way, I just recently wrote a short essay for a little book on the Salk Institute, which came out of the printers a couple of weeks ago. For me, the courtyard, the empty space between the buildings is one of the very finest architectural spaces I have ever seen, and it is interesting to think, surprising to think that it is emptiness in that case which becomes the message and makes it sublime.
Okay, there is another one. Let's see. Trying to read the new message. In his book, Genius Loci, Norbert Schulz begins the chapter Spirit of Place with the distinction of technological improvements and the landscape, because it is hard to orient or identify ourselves with the intensity of digital world. My question is, in today's world or near future, how phenomenology and digital world may tell something about the world that we live and our senses?
Well, that's exactly the purpose of phenomenology, is to reveal how we are related with the world, both in physical terms and mental terms, which cannot be separated. Phenomenology exactly studies how meanings arise in our experiences. It does not intellectualize, it encounters phenomena, and that is why the phenomenological approach, I think, is the artist's natural approach, and that is why I am personally oriented to that way of thinking.
Okay, now Asu Beşken from Karadeniz Technical University. She's expecting everybody to join Live and Arch in September, and she just wrote that you are also going to be there. Her question is, how does pandemic world and life change the meaning of senses upon space?
Well, I must say that I have had very much difficulties. I'm not speaking of technical difficulties, mental difficulties with online connection. I participated in numerous conversations and giving lectures. It is the sense of detachment and unreality in online connections which gives me mental problems. It was already in the 1960s, psychologists realized that 80% or even more than 80% of human communication takes place outside of the verbal channel and outside of our consciousness. But it is almost that all of this 80% that is cut away through the
Okay, one last question. There are many questions coming one after another, but I think it has been a long day for Juhani. So I will finish with Hava Alkanbala's question. Her question is as follows. You are the most inspiring one regarding architectural design and phenomenological reflection of design field. What is the effect of Boeing in Finnish culture?
What is the result? Sorry, can you repeat the last?
Boeing. Maybe Hava, you can ask the question yourself.
Hocam, I am very excited that my heart will stop. So I better I am not so sure if it's possible to repeat my question, but what do you think? I mean, how your studies and your mental map affected by being Finnish, being inside the Finnish culture? Thank you.
Absolutely. We are all fundamentally affected by our childhood and our culture, our surroundings, the landscapes, the light. I have traveled quite a lot all my life, and in a way, my thinking is suspended between my sense of home in Finland in a cultural sense, and then my intense travels. I believe that we all need a firm identity, because, and altogether also self-identity. I think in any artistic field, the work is very much on the work on oneself. Wittgenstein, the philosopher, for instance, once wrote, architecture and philosophy are similar. They are both ways of working on yourself. And it is the importance of self which also places in importance on one's personal history and background and geography.
Well, Juhani, I think there are more questions, but I think I don't know. I mean, if you want to answer, I can go on and on, but it's up to you. Many people are so excited. I mean, they are just so excited to be listening to you and to be able to ask you questions. But everybody wishes that they will see you in person because it's much more. I mean, it's much better to be able to see our each other face to face. So this is our general wish, let's say. Do you think, can I continue more or should I finish?
Oh, it's up to you. Not very long, but
Maybe there's a student actually. I will maybe ask. I will ask her question. Sorry, she says, "I feel so lucky to have the opportunity of asking a question to you. I'm an architecture student from Istanbul Technical University. My question is, what do you see in the next 100 years of humankind? Will sustainable architecture prevail or have no effect in the global crisis at all? What should we do to slow down the impending apocalypse?"
that's the most important question. Yes, I see that we are humanity is in great trouble in morally especially, but then also the real threats like climate change and so forth are beyond my imagination. I think humanity needs very quickly wisdom, but wisdom is disappearing. Politicians would need a lot of wisdom, but there are very few wise leaders anymore of the caliber of Václav Havel, the poet in Czechoslovakia, or Nelson Mandela in South Africa. Our culture is developing towards expertise. I'm very critical about expertise because expertise slices reality into thin slices of specialized knowledge. But we need overall understanding and particularly an ethical view. Also, architects need an ethical ground.
Okay, one last question. Bilge İşgüzar is asking, is there a thing he wished he did sooner in his life, architectural or literature-wise? Like a book that he wished he read while he was a student, etc.
Well, I wish I had begun reading seriously earlier, at a younger age. But still, when I was a child, it was normal that certain foundational books of Western culture were read, not deeply, but anyway. My wish would be that I would have started to read seriously much more earlier.
Okay, well, I think I will finish because it's quite late now. It's almost 1.5 hours since we started, and we would really like to thank you heartily for joining us tonight. Everybody is thanking, and we all wish to see you personally in the near future. Thank you very much, and thank Katri and also your wife for all their help.
Thank you. Well, I'm pleased that the Technology worked finally.
Yes, it worked finally. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank
Okay, we'll keep in touch. Goodbye.
you. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Seuraavalla olen. Niin, mä tuun kyllä mä tuun ihan. Mutta